The warm afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Church, casting colorful patterns on the wooden pews. It was an ordinary Sunday, just like any other. Families gathered, dressed in their best, whispering quiet greetings as the choir's soft melody filled the room. Among them sat Daniel and Grace Carter, a couple who had carried a silent grief for 8 long years. Grace reached for Daniel's hand, squeezing it gently, her eyes scanning the congregation, though she didn't know why. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was hope that had never truly faded. Her heart ached every time she thought about that terrible night, the night their twin daughters vanished without a trace. Born with albinism, Amelia and Ava had always drawn attention, their pale skin and bright, almost translucent eyes making them stand out wherever they went. But never in their worst nightmares had they imagined that someone would steal them away. The day it happened was still vivid in their minds. The twins had been at home with their trusted nanny, Maria, while Grace and Daniel attended a charity event. Maria had been with their family for years, a woman they trusted like their own sister. But that night, everything changed. A frantic phone call, Maria's trembling voice, and then the unbearable words, "They're gone." The police searched tirelessly. Investigators followed every lead. News stations broadcasted the story, asking the public for any information. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. And yet, no sign of their daughters. No ransom note, no clues, just an empty nursery filled with toys that would never be played with again. Grace wiped at a stray tear before it could fall, forcing herself to focus on the sermon. The pastor's voice was soothing, speaking of faith and perseverance, but her thoughts drifted. She glanced around the church, her gaze settling on a family sitting a few rows ahead. A young girl sat beside an older woman, her head tilted slightly as she whispered something. The woman nodded, and as she turned, Grace's breath caught in her throat. The girl, her hair was long, braided neatly, and her skin was pale, almost luminous under the church's dim light. And then, as if she felt Grace's stare, the girl turned. Their eyes met, and a shiver ran down Grace's spine. It couldn't be. Could it? Daniel must have sensed her tension because he followed her gaze. His grip on her hand tightened. "Grace," he whispered, voice barely audible. But before either of them could move, a quiet commotion stirred at the back of the church. A teenage boy, maybe 16, stood from his seat, offering it to a pregnant woman struggling to find a place to sit. She hesitated, then smiled gratefully, accepting the gesture. The boy nodded politely and stepped aside, his dark skin contrasting against the woman's fair complexion. As she sat, she reached into her purse, pulling out a small, folded note. She held it out to the boy, her expression unreadable. He hesitated before taking it. His brow furrowed as he read, and for a moment, he stood frozen. Then, his head snapped up, eyes wide, searching for the woman who had given it to him. But she was already gone. Grace barely noticed. Her focus was still locked on the young girl across the pews, her heart pounding. The girl looked so familiar. And when she smiled, the breath left Grace's lungs. It was Amelia. Or was it? "You said." Continue from where the introduction left off and write the next 1,000 words for my story. This part should provide background and context, helping to deepen the plot and characters. Keep building suspense, but don't resolve any of the tension created in the previous section. Expand on the mystery or conflict, and keep the narrative engaging with additional relevant keywords. Also, do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also, keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also, make the script human-centric and don't give feel of AI-generated. Also, don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy. ChatGPT said. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as he watched Grace's face drain of color. He followed her gaze back to the girl, his own breath catching in his throat. The resemblance was undeniable. The same delicate features, the same pale complexion, and those eyes that had once looked up at him from a crib, giggling, reaching for his face. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the pastor's voice anymore. Grace couldn't move. Her body felt frozen in place, her hands gripping the edge of the pew so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Could it really be Amelia? After 8 years of unanswered prayers, after so many nights spent crying herself to sleep, was this truly happening? She wanted to rush over, to wrap her arms around the girl and never let go. But fear held her back. What if she was wrong? What if she was imagining things, letting hope cloud her judgment? The girl, oblivious to the turmoil she had just caused, turned her attention back to the woman beside her. Grace studied the older woman carefully. She was in her 60s, perhaps, with kind eyes and soft wrinkles lining her face. There was nothing about her that seemed threatening. She didn't look like someone who would have stolen 2 little girls in the middle of the night. But then, neither did the people in news stories, the ones who kidnapped children and hid them in plain sight, raising them as their own. Grace's mind raced with possibilities. Could this woman have taken Amelia? And if so, where was Ava? The thought sent a sharp pang through her chest. If one of their daughters was here, alive and well, then what had happened to the other? Daniel swallowed hard, his grip tightening on Grace's hand. "We can't just sit here," he whispered. Grace nodded numbly. She knew they had to act, but they had to be careful. If they scared the girl or the woman, they could disappear before they had a chance to learn the truth. Just as she was about to stand, a quiet gasp made her turn. The teenage boy who had received the note stood frozen in the aisle, his eyes locked on the small piece of paper in his hands. His expression shifted from confusion to shock, his fingers trembling as he reread the words. He looked around frantically, scanning the church for the woman who had given him the note, but she was nowhere to be seen. Grace barely registered it, too consumed by the sight of the girl across the pews. But Daniel had noticed. He watched the boy closely, his instincts telling him that whatever was on that note was important. The boy, still gripping the paper, hesitated before slowly sinking back into his seat. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his fingers pressing the note into his palm as if it held something far greater than mere words. Daniel and Grace exchanged a quick glance. Something was happening, something bigger than they understood. And for the first time in years, it felt like the answers they had been desperately searching for were just within reach. Grace turned back to the girl, her heart hammering. She took a slow breath, then, before she could lose her nerve, she stood. She moved carefully, her steps slow and deliberate, as if approaching a delicate dream that might shatter if she moved too fast. Daniel was right behind her, his presence steadying her. The older woman noticed them first. She looked up, her eyes meeting Grace's with polite curiosity. "Excuse me," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled kindly. "Yes, dear?" Grace's gaze flickered to the girl, who was watching her with mild curiosity. Now that she was closer, she could see the small details, the familiar dimple on her left cheek, the way she twirled a strand of hair around her finger just like Amelia used to do. Grace's throat tightened. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked gently, forcing her voice to remain steady. The girl hesitated, glancing up at the woman beside her before answering. "Emma," she said softly. Grace's heart sank. That wasn't the name she had been expecting. But names could be changed. She swallowed hard. "Emma, how old are you?" 10, the girl answered without hesitation. 10. The twins would be 10 now. Grace's hands felt clammy. She wanted to ask more, but she knew she had to be careful. If this woman was truly her daughter's captor, she couldn't let on what she suspected. "That's a lovely name," Grace said with a warm smile, though her heart was breaking inside. The older woman tilted her head slightly. "Is something the matter?" Grace hesitated, glancing at Daniel. He gave her a slight nod, silently encouraging her. I couldn't help but notice how much she looks like someone I used to know," Grace said carefully. The woman's expression remained calm, unreadable. "Oh. Well, children do tend to resemble one another at times." Grace nodded, forcing a polite chuckle, but inside, she was unraveling. Daniel, sensing the tension, stepped in. "Do you mind if we ask where you're from?" he asked casually. The woman smiled. "We recently moved here from out of state," she said smoothly. "Emma is my granddaughter. She's been living with me for a few years now." A chill ran down Grace's spine. "Granddaughter." She studied the woman's face, searching for any cracks in her story, any sign of deception. But the woman remained composed, her hands resting gently in her lap. Grace knew she had to tread carefully. If this woman had truly taken Amelia, then pushing too hard could make her run. Just as she was about to speak again, a movement caught her eye. The teenage boy from earlier was standing up once more, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked toward the doors of the church, as if contemplating something. Then, with sudden determination, he turned and hurried out. Daniel saw it too. He hesitated only for a moment before whispering, "I'll follow him." Grace nodded, barely able to breathe as he slipped away. Her focus returned to the girl Emma, who was now looking at her with mild curiosity. Grace's mind screamed with questions. Was this really her daughter? And if so, where was Ava? And more importantly, if this woman had taken her, how would they get her back? Grace forced herself to keep smiling, though every fiber of her being was screaming at her to grab the girl and run. But she couldn't. Not yet. She needed to be sure. She needed proof. If she made the wrong move, the woman could disappear with Emma, and she couldn't risk that. The woman studied Grace with a polite but cautious expression, as if trying to gauge why a stranger was so interested in her granddaughter. Grace's mind raced for a way to keep the conversation going without raising suspicion. "She has such beautiful eyes," Grace said softly. "They remind me of someone I used to know." Emma, if that was really her name, smiled shyly, looking down at her lap. The woman placed a protective hand on the girl's back, her posture subtly shifting, as if shielding her from any unwanted attention. "Thank you," the woman replied. "She gets that a lot." Something in her tone was off. Too smooth, too rehearsed. Grace felt Daniel's absence beside her like a missing limb. She had to trust that he would find something, anything, that could help them. Meanwhile, Daniel moved swiftly through the church, pushing through the crowd to follow the teenage boy who had rushed out moments earlier. He caught sight of him near the entrance, standing just outside on the church steps, gripping the note in his hand like it held the weight of the world. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before stepping up beside him. "Hey," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The boy flinched slightly, turning to face him. His eyes were wide, uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he should answer. Daniel could see the conflict written all over his face. Whatever was in that note had shaken him. I don't know," the boy muttered. "This note, it's weird." Daniel kept his voice calm. "Can I see it?" The boy hesitated, gripping it tighter, then after a long pause, he slowly handed it over. Daniel unfolded the paper carefully. The message was short, written in neat but hurried handwriting. "Go to 124, Willow Lane. 8 p.m. No police. The truth is there." Daniel's stomach twisted. The truth. He didn't know who had written it or why it had been given to this boy, but something told him this wasn't a coincidence. "Who gave this to you?" Daniel asked. The boy shook his head. "I don't know. She was just some woman. She looked normal, like anyone else. But she slipped it to me right before she left. I didn't even realize what it was until I read it." Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Whoever wrote this note wanted to stay hidden. And they wanted someone to find something big enough to require secrecy. "Do you have any idea what this is about?" Daniel asked. The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "No, but it feels important." Daniel studied him. The boy seemed honest, but there was something in his eyes, something unsettled, like he wasn't telling the whole truth. "Do you want to go?" Daniel asked. "To the address?" The boy let out a shaky breath. "I don't know. It could be dangerous." Daniel nodded. "It could be. But sometimes, danger is the only way to get to the truth." The boy swallowed hard, then looked down at the note again. "What if it's a trap?" Daniel thought for a moment. "Then we'll be careful. But if there's even a chance that this leads to something important, I think we should go." The boy looked at him, searching his face for something, reassurance, maybe. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll go." Meanwhile, back inside the church, Grace was running out of time. She needed a way to get more information without scaring off the woman. "How long have you been in town?" she asked, keeping her tone light. The woman smiled politely. "A few months now." We wanted a fresh start somewhere quiet. Grace's stomach clenched. That makes sense, she said carefully. It must be nice, raising your granddaughter. The woman's expression flickered for a split second, so fast that Grace almost missed it. But she saw it. The hesitation. The slight tightening of her jaw. Yes, the woman finally said. She's a blessing. Grace's heart pounded. If this woman had stolen her daughter, she had been raising her for years. Did Emma even know the truth? Did she have any memories of her real parents? Before Grace could ask anything else, the woman gently patted Emma's shoulder. Come on, sweetheart. It's time to go. Panic flared in Grace's chest. Wait. But the woman was already rising, gathering her things. Emma looked up at Grace once more, her innocent eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, it felt like she recognized something, some deep, unspoken connection. Grace couldn't let them leave. Not yet. Would you mind if we talked again sometime? Grace asked, keeping her voice calm. I'd love to hear more about your time here. The woman studied her carefully, as if trying to decide if Grace was a threat. Finally, she gave a slow nod. Perhaps, she said smoothly. We'll see. And with that, she led Emma away, disappearing into the crowd. Grace felt her breath hitch, her hands trembling as she watched them go. She had just come face to face with her daughter. She was sure of it. But where was Ava? And who was waiting for them at 124, Willow Lane? Grace stood frozen in the middle of the church, her heart hammering against her ribs. Emma was gone. She had just watched what she was almost certain was her daughter walk away with a woman who might have stolen her. And she had done nothing to stop it. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to chase after them, to demand answers, but she knew she had to be careful. If this woman had really taken Emma, then one wrong move could make her disappear forever. Daniel. She needed Daniel. She turned sharply, scanning the church, but he was nowhere to be seen. Her mind raced. He had followed the teenage boy outside, the one with the note. What was on that paper? Did it have anything to do with Emma? Grace pushed through the lingering crowd, moving quickly toward the exit. When she stepped outside, the late afternoon air hit her, but it did nothing to cool the fire of panic rising in her chest. Her eyes darted around until she spotted Daniel standing at the bottom of the church steps, speaking in low tones to the boy. She rushed toward them. Daniel, she called. He turned immediately, his expression tense. Grace. His voice was careful, like he was bracing for what she was about to say. She's gone, Grace said breathlessly. Emma. The woman took her. Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced at the boy beside him, then back at Grace. We need to talk. The boy shifted uncomfortably. I don't know if this means anything, but, the note. Grace frowned. What note? Daniel handed it to her, and the second her eyes landed on the words, a chill ran down her spine. Go to 124, Willow Lane. 8 p.m. No police. The truth is there. Her throat went dry. The truth, she whispered. Daniel nodded. We don't know who left it. But something tells me it's connected to everything happening right now. Grace swallowed hard. We have to go. The boy hesitated. What if it's dangerous? Daniel exhaled, looking between them. Then we'll be careful. But we can't ignore this. Not now. The boy looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment, he nodded. Okay. Grace turned back toward the parking lot, her stomach twisting with unease. The woman had taken Emma. She had let her walk away. But now, maybe they were about to find out why. The drive to 124, Willow Lane was silent, tension thick in the air. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Every mile that passed made Grace's hands grip the steering wheel tighter. Daniel sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the road, deep in thought. The boy sat in the back, shifting nervously. When they finally turned onto Willow Lane, the street was quiet, lined with old houses, their windows glowing dimly in the fading light. 124 was at the very end. Grace pulled up slowly, her stomach twisting. The house was small, worn but not abandoned. The porch light flickered faintly. Are we sure about this? The boy asked. Daniel glanced at Grace, then back at the house. We need answers. They stepped out cautiously, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. As they approached the porch, every step felt heavier. Grace reached out, hesitated for just a second, then knocked. Silence. She exchanged a glance with Daniel. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The door creaked open. A woman stood there, older, with deep lines on her face and tired eyes that held something familiar. Something heavy. She looked at them for a long moment before finally speaking. I was wondering when you'd come. Grace's breath caught. What? The woman stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in. You need to hear the truth. Daniel hesitated. Who are you? The woman's expression darkened. The only person willing to tell you what really happened to your daughters. Grace's knees almost buckled. Daughters. Plural. She gripped Daniel's arm. Ava. She was still out there. And they were about to find out where. Grace's heart pounded as she stepped over the threshold, her legs unsteady. The woman's words echoed in her head. Daughters. Had she really said that? Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her lower back as they moved inside. The boy followed hesitantly, his wide eyes scanning the dimly lit living room. It smelled of old wood and something faintly floral, like dried lavender tucked away in forgotten corners. The furniture was sparse, just a worn-out couch, a wooden coffee table, and a single lamp flickering weakly. The woman closed the door behind them, locking it with a slow click. Grace felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Please, the woman said, gesturing toward the couch. Sit. Grace didn't move. Tell me what you meant, she demanded, her voice trembling. You said daughters. Do you know where Ava is? The woman's face softened just a fraction. I do, she said. But you need to understand, this goes deeper than you think. Grace's breath hitched. Where is she? The woman exhaled, her fingers gripping the back of a wooden chair. Before I answer that, I need to tell you the truth about what happened 8 years ago. Daniel's jaw tightened. We already know. They were taken from their nanny. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes. But do you know why? A sharp silence filled the air. Grace swallowed hard. What do you mean? The woman glanced at the boy, then back at them. I was the one who took them. The room spun. Grace's vision blurred at the edges, and she felt Daniel tense beside her. You, Grace's voice cracked. You stole them? The woman held up a hand. I didn't have a choice. Daniel's hands curled into fists. There's always a choice. The woman's eyes darkened. Not when you're trying to save them. Grace's breath caught. Save them? From what? The woman sat down slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. From the people who really took them. From the people who would have used them for something terrible. The boy shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door. Grace barely noticed. Every part of her was locked on the woman in front of her. You're lying, she whispered. You're just trying to justify what you did. The woman looked at her, her gaze steady. I know how this sounds. But if I hadn't taken them, they wouldn't be alive today. Grace shook her head. Where is Ava? She repeated, her voice more desperate now. Where is she? The woman hesitated. She's safe, she said. But she doesn't know who you are. Grace's stomach clenched. What? She was raised to believe she belongs to someone else, the woman admitted. She has no memory of you. No memory of Emma. She thinks she's someone else entirely. A cold wave of nausea washed over Grace. 8 years. Ava had been out there somewhere, growing up in a stranger's home, believing a lie. Daniel's voice was tight with controlled anger. Who raised her? The woman's eyes flickered with something almost like guilt. A powerful family, she said. The kind that doesn't like to be challenged. Grace's pulse roared in her ears. You're telling me my daughter is alive, but she doesn't know me? That some strangers have been raising her all these years. The woman nodded slowly. And they will do anything to keep her. Grace felt like the air had been stolen from her lungs. Her daughters had been together all this time, and she hadn't even known. That woman, had been standing right in front of her, holding Emma's hand, walking away while Grace had done nothing. She gripped Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We have to go," she choked out. "We have to get them back." Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched. He turned to the woman, his voice sharp. "Where are they?" The woman hesitated, then slowly reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She handed it to Grace, her eyes unreadable. "She has them here," she said. "But if you're going to get them, you have to move fast. She's planning to leave tonight." Grace's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. An address. A location just outside of town. Daniel didn't waste another second. He grabbed Grace's hand and pulled her toward the door. The boy followed, his face pale. "Wait," he said, looking between them. "You don't even know what you're walking into." Grace turned to him, her voice shaking. "I don't care. I'm not losing them again." The drive felt like a blur. Every second that passed was agony. The road stretched ahead of them in eerie silence, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on Grace like a boulder. When they finally reached the address, it was almost completely dark. The house sat back from the road, hidden behind towering trees. A single light glowed from the porch. Daniel killed the engine. Grace's pulse pounded in her ears. "Stay behind me," Daniel murmured. Grace nodded, though she knew she wouldn't hold back if she saw her daughters. The boy hesitated. "Are we sure about this?" Daniel didn't answer. He stepped out of the car, moving swiftly, Grace right beside him. The air was thick with tension. Every sound felt amplified, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. As they approached the house, the front door creaked open. Grace's breath caught. The woman stood in the doorway, her face calm, unreadable. Emma stood beside her, her small fingers wrapped around the woman's hand. Grace's knees almost gave out. "Emma," she whispered. The little girl blinked up at her, confusion flickering across her face. "Do I know you?" The words cut deeper than any knife. Grace felt a sob rise in her throat. She wanted to run, to scoop her daughter into her arms, to tell her everything. But she forced herself to stay still. She had to be careful. Daniel took a slow step forward. "Where is Ava?" The woman tilted her head. "Inside." Grace clenched her fists. "Let us see her." The woman sighed, then stepped aside. "Come in." Daniel exchanged a wary glance with Grace, then nodded. Together, they stepped inside. The house was quiet. Too quiet. And then, Grace saw her. A girl sat on the couch, her back to them, her dark hair falling past her shoulders. She turned slightly at the sound of their footsteps. Grace's breath hitched. She knew that face. Older. Different. But still her. "Ava," Grace whispered, stepping forward. The girl frowned. "Who are you?" Grace's heart shattered. The woman behind them closed the door softly. "She doesn't remember," she said. Ava looked at Emma, then back at Grace and Daniel. She shifted uncomfortably. "Why are you here?" Tears burned in Grace's eyes. "Because you're my daughter," she said desperately. "Both of you are." Ava stiffened. Emma frowned, looking up at the woman. "Grandma, what is she talking about?" "Grandma." Grace felt her stomach drop. Daniel tensed beside her. "They don't know," he muttered under his breath. The woman sighed. "I was going to tell them," she said. "When the time was right." Grace's breath came in short gasps. "You stole them from me," she spat. "You don't get to decide what's right." The woman's expression darkened. "You think this was about you?" Daniel stepped forward. "Then tell us what it was about." The woman exhaled. "I took them because they were in danger. Because if I hadn't, they would have been lost forever." Grace's fists clenched. "You expect us to believe that?" The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Believe what you want," she said. "But the truth is, I was protecting them." Ava's voice was small. "From what?" The woman turned to her, her eyes softening. "From people who wanted to take you away." Ava's face twisted in confusion. "But, didn't you take us away?" For the first time, the woman looked uncertain. Grace took a shaky breath. "Ava, Emma, listen to me. I am your mother. You were taken from me when you were babies. I have been searching for you for 8 years. Ava stared at her, something flickering in her expression. Doubt. Fear. Recognition. But before anyone could say another word, the boy who had been silent all this time let out a sharp breath. This doesn't feel right, he whispered. Then, before anyone could react, the lights cut out. Ava let out a startled gasp. Emma whimpered. Daniel moved fast, reaching for Grace, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Then came the sound of footsteps. Outside. Daniel turned sharply. We're not alone. Grace's blood ran cold. The woman cursed under her breath. They found us. Grace barely had time to ask who they were before the front door burst open. And chaos erupted. The door crashed open, slamming against the wall with a force that sent a jolt of fear through Grace's body. She instinctively pulled Emma into her arms, shielding her as Daniel moved in front of them. Ava froze, her breath shallow, eyes darting in the darkness. The woman, the one who had stolen them, stood rigid, her face pale as shadows moved in the doorway. Then came the voices. Low, urgent. A mix of men and women, their footsteps heavy as they poured into the house. Get the kids, someone barked. Grace's heart pounded. No. Not again. She wouldn't lose them again. Daniel lunged first, grabbing a chair and shoving it toward the nearest figure. A loud crash followed as the man stumbled back. Grace barely had time to process before the woman, the one she had hated moments ago, moved to protect them. You said we had time, she hissed at one of the intruders. You weren't supposed to come yet. The person, a tall man in a dark coat, sneered. You don't get to decide that. Everything clicked in Grace's mind. The woman had been hiding them. But from who? Daniel didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed Ava's wrist and pulled her toward the door, his voice sharp. We need to get out of here. Now. Ava hesitated for a split second before following him. Grace held Emma tight and ran after them, her pulse roaring in her ears. The front yard was pitch black, the trees towering like silent witnesses to their escape. But the intruders weren't far behind. Heavy footsteps pounded against the wooden floor inside. More voices. More shouting. Grace's chest tightened. She wasn't fast enough. Emma was small, but in her arms, she felt impossibly heavy. Daniel was already ahead, pushing Ava forward. Then came the sound of tires screeching. Headlights cut through the darkness. A van. Parked near the trees. More figures emerged from the shadows. Waiting. Trapping them. Grace skidded to a stop. No, she whispered. Daniel cursed under his breath. They were ready for this. The woman's voice rang out from behind them. Run toward the creek. There's a path. Grace didn't trust her. Not after everything. But what choice did she have? Daniel grabbed Ava's hand again, leading her away from the van. Grace followed, her legs burning as they stumbled over uneven ground. Emma clung to her neck, burying her face in her shoulder. Mommy, I'm scared, she whimpered. Grace's throat tightened. I know, baby. Hold on to me. Branches whipped against them as they ran. The shouts behind them grew louder. Someone crashed through the trees, close, too close. Then, suddenly, sirens. A blinding wave of red and blue lights flooded the trees, cutting through the night like fire. The shouts turned frantic. Someone cursed. Then the voice of authority boomed through the chaos. Freeze. Hands where we can see them. Grace nearly collapsed in relief. Police cars screeched to a halt near the road, officers spilling out with flashlights and weapons drawn. The intruders turned, some running, others raising their hands in surrender. Daniel held onto Ava, shielding her. Grace fell to her knees, gasping for breath, still clutching Emma. Officers swarmed the area. The woman, the one who had stolen them, stood still, her hands raised, her face unreadable as she was surrounded. One officer approached Grace, his voice steady. Are you hurt? Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her face. My daughters, she looked at Ava, then Emma. I have them. I finally have them. The officer nodded, glancing toward the others. We've been tracking this operation for years. You're lucky we got here in time. Grace's mind spun. What was this? Who were they? The officer's jaw tightened. A group involved in child trafficking. The woman who took your daughters wasn't working alone. She might have protected them in her own way, but she was part of it at some point. Grace turned, staring at the woman. She was being led away, cuffs around her wrists. For the first time, the woman looked at Grace, not with anger, not with fear, but with something almost like relief. Ava's voice was small. She told me she was keeping us safe. Grace swallowed hard. Maybe she thought she was. Ava hesitated, then stepped toward Grace. Are you really my mom? Grace's breath caught. Yes, baby, she whispered. I am. Ava's face twisted with emotions too big for her young heart to hold. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she let Grace hold her. Grace wrapped her arms around both of them, Ava and Emma, pulling them close. Daniel knelt beside them, his voice thick with emotion. We're going home. Ava didn't speak. She just nodded against Grace's shoulder, as if for the first time, she believed it. The officers worked quickly, detaining the rest of the group, taking statements. The night stretched long, but Grace didn't care. She had both of her daughters. And she would never let them go again. As they drove away from the scene, Emma asleep in her lap, Ava watching the dark road ahead, Grace reached for Daniel's hand. He squeezed it tightly. She had spent 8 years searching for answers. 8 years longing to hear her daughters' voices. 8 years haunted by the fear that she would never see them again. But tonight, under the glow of streetlights guiding them home, the nightmare was finally over.